Historical Research hosts an annual lecture, and it's sponsored by our publisher, Oxford University Press. And I'd love to thank OUP for sponsoring this evening's event. It's been wonderful getting to work with OUP to develop the journal for the 2020s. In keeping with the Institute's remit, the Historical Research Lecture focuses on questions of historical method and approach. And this year, under the current circumstances, we reconfigured the event as an online panel, which will explore a new and very fitting subject: writing histories of 2020, responses and perspectives. And tonight we want to ask, at this very early stage, how might future historians seek to write the history of 2020? When will 2020 become a subject for historical analysis? And how should today's historians and record keepers prepare for this task? Offering their thoughts on this critical subject tonight are Professor Claire Langhamer. Claire is Professor of Modern British History and Trustee of the Mass Observation Archive at Sussex University. She is the author of the wonderful book, The English in Love, The Intimate Story of an Emotional Revolution. Professor Kevin Siena. Kevin is a historian of early modern disease at Trent University, Ontario. His most recent book is Rotten Bodies, Class and Contagion in 18th Century Britain, and that was published by Yale in 2019. And Professor Richard Vinen is Professor of History at King's College London and a leading contemporary historian. His most recent book is The Long 68, Radical Protest and Its Enemies. So our speakers will start by offering a short presentation, and then we're going to follow up with a panel discussion, and then we have an opportunity to open up questions to you, our audience. And the way that we will do that this evening is to ask you to use the chat function. So if you look to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button called chat. You can open that up and you can type your questions in there, and we'll curate those questions. Obviously, we won't be able to respond to them all this evening, but we'll do our best to collect some of the key questions together and pose those questions to our panel. You'll note that you're all on mute for now, and that's in keeping with Zoom protocols, and it will help us to minimize any background noise. So that's the plan for this evening. I hope that we're going to have a really exciting and interesting discussion, and capitalizing on history's perspective to be more predictive and creative, as well as looking back. So we'll start, I think, with Richard. Richard, can I pass over to you?
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for organising this thing. I think I should begin by saying that I'm much less of an expert than my co-panelists on specific issues, and I'm probably less sophisticated in terms of thinking about methodology. So thoughts I will offer may be a rather kind of banal starting point. I'd also like to suggest that one of the ways we might think about COVID is thinking about how it will affect how we write the history of other periods, not just COVID as a subject, but COVID as a prism through which we'll see other kinds of history. I want to start with periodization. R.W. Johnson, political scientist, once wrote an amusing essay about growing up in the 50s and 60s, in which he said he continuously and impatiently asked, when will the post-war be over? And I think there was this sense that the war was such a kind of cataclysmic event, it overshadowed things that came afterwards for a very long time. Now, suddenly, in recent years, it seems that we have a whole lot of new epochs coming on us very, very quickly. So 9/11, the financial crash, a whole series of events that people say are turning points. And I suppose one question we are asked is, how much is COVID a real turning point, and how much is it going to fall into a perspective in the long term? I'm very struck by Peter Hennessy's remarks about this, where he said that COVID would reperiodize how we think about modern history. He said there'll be a BC and an AC, a before COVID and an after COVID. And also, of course, being someone very focused on 1945 as this great seminal moment in British history, he is very prone to compare COVID with 1945 as a kind of refounding event. So in one of his talks on the topic, he said, in a very kind of specific comparison with the Second World War, that we needed a new society which would, as he put it, be a memorial for the COVID fallen. Now, I think this is actually a view of COVID that I worry about. I worry about it, first of all, because it seems to me to be just statistically distorting. So one of the things we should say is, of course, the British have a particular view of the Second World War, partly because as far as the British were concerned, the Second World War was not a particularly mortal event. Casualties were quite low for the British in the Second World War compared to other countries, but they were still very high compared to the total number of deaths that have been caused so far by COVID. And obviously there's a huge difference between an event that's killing 25-year-olds and an event that's primarily killing the old and people who have other conditions. So, the effect of COVID, I think we can exaggerate in that way. I think it's also deceptive kind of comparison, because the whole point about war is it's the product of human agency, it's the product of decisions, and therefore it's a very kind of obvious subject for historians, something which can be explained in terms of causes and consequences, so that clearly historians were involved in how the world was rethought after both world wars in terms of a new kind of international order, a new kind of society. It's much less obvious that COVID has those kind of lessons. Obviously, there's something you said about the response to COVID, but COVID itself, in some ways, is an extra historical event. We can't say anything about it except, that someone had an unfortunate experience in a Chinese wet market, as far as we can see, and therefore it's a kind of meteorite strike. It's something that's much less obvious as a topic for historians to look at like that. How might it challenge kind of periodization of history? I suspect the answer is, in the long term, it will fit in with other things. So I'm thinking particularly the rise of China and perhaps the kind of changes we might have seen in the world with the election of Donald Trump and new assertiveness on the part of Russia. So I think there'll be lots of ways in which we'll look back, not so much to a pre-COVID period as to perhaps a pre-2016 period. And I wonder slightly if we'll end up saying that there was a kind of second Belle Epoque from about the fall of the Berlin Wall to some point in the middle part of the last decade, which is a period where liberal democracy seemed very secure. In a way, I think it might seem a bit less secure now. Of course, all of this depends partly on what happens next. And at this point, the great cliche is always to cite Chu En-lai saying about the French Revolution. I think it's a bit too early to say what the consequences will be. That's a double-edged quote, because of course Chu En-lai wasn't actually talking about the revolution of 1789. He was talking about what he regarded as the revolution of 1968. And 1968 in France is a very sobering thing to think about at the moment, because if you'd stopped the clock on the 28th of May 1968, you would have said that French capitalism had been damaged beyond repair and Gaullism was finished. And actually a few months later, the Gaullists win a huge majority in the legislative elections, and capitalism for the next 5 or 6 years goes on to grow, to experience its most spectacular growth in French history. So we shouldn't anticipate that we necessarily know what's going to happen next. And I'm very struck particularly with the way in which at the moment, in some ways, politics is in suspension. I think we'll know a lot about the political fallout from COVID when there's a big election in any country. And I'm very struck by Nixon's remark again in '68 about the silent majority. And it seems to me that's particularly relevant now, and particularly with people's means of communication because of social media. So I feel one of the key lessons should be at the moment that people who tweet often don't vote, and people who vote often don't tweet. So I think that will have an effect that we might not anticipate. Beyond that, I think there are two things I would like to focus on, one of which is very brief, which is the national as a kind of framework for historical analysis. And I'm struck by how important the national is in explaining COVID's different trajectories in various countries. And I do mean the national rather than the state, in the sense it seems to me if you want to explain what's happened in Sweden versus what's happened in New Zealand, you have to look at a national society, not just at government decisions. And it's striking how national societies have responded differently. Now, a second thing that I think might come back a bit with COVID is another thing that historians haven't talked about very much, which is social class. And I suppose the Greek cliche is to say, well, class has been replaced by sex and race and other categories that we use nowadays. But I also think one of the reasons why we don't talk about class much in recent years is because being middle class in a lot of analysis has become a kind of default option. It's very noticeable, for example, in the work of Thomas Piketty, that very much the assumption is being middle class is normal, and then there's this tiny minority of very, very privileged people who are kind of separate from the middle classes. there's also a globalization of the middle class, so that we tend to assume that China or India now are middle class societies because their kind of public presentation is a very middle class society. I think this, of course, is highly misleading. It's misleading even with regard to Western industrialized countries to say that the whole population is middle class. Probably North America is the only place where this begins to be true. And I think COVID has had paradoxical effects. So on the one hand, the response to COVID is often a very kind of class-based response, so that it's based on, it seems to me, three assumptions. One of which, of course, is to do with what we're doing now, which is kind of, we're all on Zoom. We're all white-collar workers. Now, obviously, one of the things actually exposed by COVID is there are lots of people who do jobs which are not white-collar and which they can't stop or do in a way that doesn't involve physical labor. And the second of which is obviously economic security. One of the key questions to be asked about the whole response to COVID is, how long can people in various parts of the world survive when the economy is no longer working? And the third thing, I think, is the idea of home. Home, this great icon of middle-class identity. And I'm very struck by the idea that, you know, COVID is all about staying at home. And of course, this assumes that everybody has a home. This is conspicuously not true. In India, there are 140 million migrant laborers. And I can't help thinking, when we write the kind of global history of COVID eventually, we'll say that what happened to Indian migrant workers just after the lockdown introduced, you know, extraordinarily short notice in very, very difficult ways. That was really the great drama of COVID, in the same way that we might now say about the Second World War, that perhaps the Bengal famine was a larger drama than, I don't know, Dunkirk or the Battle of Britain or something. So I think that may shift our analysis. I think I should finish where I always finish these talks, because I think I must be coming up or over my 7 minutes, by saying that, of course, we should treat the historical profession itself as an object of historical study, and we should ask how it's going to be changed by COVID. Now, obviously, the brutal answer to that question in the short term, I'm afraid, is that there's probably not going to be a terrible amount of recruitment in the next few years. And so there's going to be a bit of a kind of freeze of how the historical profession works. I think also that inevitably there's going to be a certain marginalization of the historical profession. So although clearly we're all very keen to put history at the center of analysis and to say how history should be important, I'm very struck by the extent to which COVID has actually privileged other kinds of public intellectuals rather than historians. So very obviously, you know, virologists and biologists, but also people like behavioral scientists. And I think partly because COVID is this very kind of staccato event that's happened in a very short term, it pushes very much towards a more presentist interpretation, which may not necessarily be a bad thing and may not necessarily be a wrong interpretation. And I will finish with one perhaps rather inexcusably flippant remark about this, which is that I can't say I've enjoyed many aspects of COVID, but I have derived a certain amount of amusement from the fact that every time I hear the word Professor Neil Ferguson on the radio now, I know I'm about to hear an epidemiologist rather than Neil Ferguson, the historian. Okay, I will leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Claire.
Thanks, Jo. So in May 2020, the Mass Observation Project made its annual appeal for members of the public to record a day in their life for posterity. The May the 12th diary was inaugurated back in 1937, when Mass Observation recruited a group of what it insisted on calling ordinary, hard-working folk to record the details of their lives on the 12th of every month. This was to lead up to a record of everyday life on an unusual day, 12th of May 1937, the date set for King George VI's coronation. The 12th of May 2020 was a Tuesday, and it should have been an ordinary working day for most of us. Yet this particular May the 12th was, as one diarist put it, anything but ordinary. The diary was written as the UK entered its 7th week of lockdown. If a sense of historical significance had spurred Mass Observation's work in the 30s and 40s, the 2020 context seemed to make collecting the details of everyday life just as vital. In 2019, Mass Observation had received 224 replies to its 12th of May appeal. In 2020, it received over 5,000. Perhaps more than any moment in the last 50 years, the present crisis has driven a commitment to and plethora of everyday record keeping and creative record making. This is fueled by a sense that we are living through one of the folds in history. Universities, community groups, archives and museums have thrown themselves into creative online data gathering practices, with life writing one of the most popular modes of response. Hannah Flint of the Centre for Narrative Research at UEL has compiled a list of such projects. Most have encouraged the general public to record their feelings, their observations and their experiences. The Letters of Constraint project at the National Justice Museum in Nottingham has used individual accounts of isolation to create an audio artwork. Those running life writing of immeasurable events at Oxford Centre for Life Writing have been sending creative prompts to participants in an attempt to, quote, open up possibilities to the imagination in these strange times. One of my favourites is the Coronavirus Lost and Found archive, which provides a digital home for the sadness and kindness of pandemic life, allowing losses and gains of all shapes and sizes to be shared and acknowledged, grieved and celebrated. Some of these projects collect written and visual accounts of the present. Others call for future thinking or seek out the stories of particular communities. An example of the latter is the International Disability Alliance's Voices of People with Disabilities During COVID-19 project. And of course, different groups and particularly different generations have used different formats to articulate their experiences. TikTok offers a particularly rich and often acutely funny insight into the everyday experiences of young people, for example. Those who have recorded their lives at this moment seem to assume that recent events will have long-term historical significance. They sometimes explicitly address an audience of future historians. To a historical profession under concerted attack, this might be reassuring. Perhaps we do have a future after all. A Glasgow woman puts it well. I want this diary to matter to future historians of our times. I feel I speak as a mother and a world citizen. In this respect, the COVID-19 material has a similar feel to mass observation Second World War diaries, perhaps because those earlier diaries offer a model for writing, for life writing in difficult times. Apparently distinctive experiences of time and space have facilitated this urge to document the present, even as inequalities in access to both of these have been exacerbated by the crisis. Quote, only a few months ago, I regarded my job as tedious and unimportant, writes an Asda till operator, but I am now regarded as a key worker. A nurse explains that my life has probably remained much closer to normal than most. Those who are not in key worker roles and who don't have caring responsibilities have found themselves experiencing time differently to those who are and do. For many, temporality has a new texture. Time has seemed to move both slowly and quickly, providing opportunities for the kind of contemplation that is well suited to self-writing. The COVID-19 moment has been captured in things, sounds, and new traditions too. In masks and PPE, in supermarket delivery vans, in birdsong, in rainbows, and Black Lives Matter posters. It is there in the anti-racist marches, in clapping for carers, and in PE with Jo.Fox. All of these should find their way into the archive of COVID-19 life. A sense of loss for the apparent normality of a very recent past encourages us to capture the present, lest it should also dissipate. Looking at the mass observation diaries, the sense of living through history is palpable, but also elusive. A 26-year-old Londoner confided, "It's odd. You always feel like you'd feel the difference when something historical is happening around you, but instead, normal life goes on." For a university researcher in Leeds, the thing that bothers me most is a sense of living through a time of such rapid change and disruption and feeling that I have so little of use to contribute. And of course, history has done a lot of work recently, whether in the harnessing of VE Day or the valorisation of the NHS. Nonetheless, history can also be forgetful where medical catastrophes are concerned. As Nancy Bristow reminds us, individual memories of the 1918 to 1920 influenza pandemic rapidly faded from the public sphere, even if private trauma persisted. This is why archives of the everyday will matter when we come to write histories of 2020. Such archives are messy and expansive. They resist overarching narratives whilst offering a sense of collective documentary. They will help us to explore the questions we need to ask. Did the pandemic slow or quicken existing trends? What was its impact on inequality? What did it do to intimacy, to work, to politics, to the economy, and to culture? But they will also suggest new research questions about the meanings and significance of this moment. Whilst future historians will certainly want to pose the so-called big questions about this time, they may just find the answers to these questions in the minutiae and the texture of everyday life. And with this in mind, I just want to finish with an extract from one of the May the 12th diaries that I particularly liked. Today makes it 58 days since I've seen the face I love in front of me. I never counted the days before. It was just a given I'd see him on the weekend and we'd have a nice weekend in our bubble away from reality. He doesn't even know I love him. Well, I think he does. But we've never said it out loud. We have our ways. I actually now daydream about telling him in person because I think after all this, we should allow each other that. So if that doesn't happen for a long time yet, I love you so much, E. I've had a rough few years, heartache, stress, loss, and last year I even ended up in hospital. This year was meant to be the most uneventful year I ever had. I remember shouting at the sky to please grant me a year where nothing dramatic would occur. Let me get a year to just find my footing again and heal. But it's 2020, and this is the year where COVID-19 took root across the world.
Thanks very much, Claire. Kevin.
Thanks. Geez. Thanks for having me, and whoever came up with the idea for this forum and ask this great question. It's been terrific to think about these last few weeks. I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging that I speak to you all today from the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. I offer my gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and their teachings about our earth and relations, and I strive to honor those. To the question, how might future historians respond to COVID in 2020, I'd like to start by proposing that it's quite impossible to predict. And I don't mean that as an easy cop-out, but rather I want to make the point that the history of remembering and recording epidemics suggests that we have to consider a very wide range of possibilities. And I'll make this case by quickly comparing two cases. It's well known, for starters, that plague ravaged London in 1665 and 6, killing 100,000. That turned out to effectively be the disease's swan song in England, for only a handful of cases would be noted over the next 3 centuries. So how was that event remembered over the next 100 years or so? Well, roughly 50 years on, we can see that it was alive and well in texts like Defoe's influential historical fiction, The Journal of the Plague Year. Now, Defoe had an audience for this work in 1722 precisely because plague raged in France at that moment, and Britons remained terrified that it was about to strike them again. So plague was not yet relegated to history in the early 18th century. It was very much a current event. And this continued right through to the dawn of the 19th century. To take one example, when citizens tried to block the establishment of the Manchester Fever Hospital in the late 1790s, their arguments dripped with terrified memories of plague. They referred to the hospital as a lazaretto. They cited medical theories about plague. They invoked the great epidemic of the 60s. They even used plague-era quarantine legislation to try to make legal arguments to prevent the establishment of the hospital using basically zoning law. Yet this was 130 years since plague had struck England. These people were roughly 4 generations removed from it. Now let's compare that situation to an example that Claire just mentioned, an example that was much in the news this past spring, the 1918 flu pandemic. At first glance, the many news reports comparing 2020 to 1918 this past spring would seem to suggest that the memory of flu played a similar role in the 21st century as memories of plague had in the 18. However, before March 2020, the 1918 flu pandemic wallowed in relative historical obscurity. And I emphasize relative because obviously it's been the focus of terrific scholarship. But at the risk of the anecdotal, when I mention the 1918 flu pandemic to my students every year, they typically have no idea what I'm talking about. And if we compare that with the historical footprint of an event from the same moment, the First World War, a picture emerges. The war dwarfs the pandemic in the historical imagination, and yet many more people died in the pandemic. So an estimated 20 million died in the war across 4 years, while roughly 50 to 100 million people died of flu in about 2. Now we can debate why, but it is certainly instructive that the event with the far greater body count quietly slipped into a 2nd or 3rd tier position of historical importance. The pandemic largely became a footnote to the war. Doesn't it suddenly seem now peculiar in 2020 that 50 to 100 million people could die in a global pandemic and yet that not register as a first order historical event? We can probably thank the stunning success of 20th century biomedicine. It seems that generations of Westerners raised in relative security from the worst horrors of disease felt less need to register the epidemic as a keystone historical event. As doctors rendered disease after disease toothless by inoculation or antibiotics, medical history, literally the remembering of past diseases, became something of a niche historical pastime studied by specialists, but relatively few others. However, as plague showed, that was not always the case. So these very different cases would suggest that how COVID will be remembered is still very much up in the air. And it will largely depend on events that are still to come, as Richard points out, because these are going to shape the world in which future historians will write. Their concerns are going to drive the historiography. And if I had to bet, I would guess that somehow COVID's history will be shot through with environmental themes, because climate crisis is sure to drive research agendas in coming decades. So, for example, future historians may focus heavily on the zoonotic nature of COVID to explore our relations with the biosphere, our encroachment upon habitat, our reliance on factory animal farming, or they may look to COVID in 2020 as a kind of political and cultural dry run for environmental action, which either will or won't take place in coming decades. The two crises, COVID and climate change, share key features. Both are global in scope. Both require collective action. Both require behavioral change at the individual and community levels alongside sweeping policy change at the governmental level. And both are crises that require that citizens and leaders heed scientific advice. So future historians may well use the COVID crisis as a window through which to gauge different countries' political and cultural readiness to tackle climate change at this particular moment. It is, of course, early days, but the picture from the United States, for example, does not inspire confidence. If they do pursue this line of inquiry, if they use COVID as a window to explore deeper issues, other issues, they will be keeping certainly with long traditions within medical history. Epidemics put communities under stress and thereby act as a kind of cross-section. They slice societies wide open, and so that historians can view their inner workings, their politics, their social relations, etc. And here, attention to social justice and inequality is one example of a very common theme in epidemic historiography that is likely to continue to play a major role. Epidemics show vividly where power is and isn't. So issues like class, race, religion, immigration status, these things almost always influence not only policy during epidemics, but material outcomes of life and death. Current statistics show that COVID is not egalitarian. It is striking the poor and communities of color at much higher rates in jurisdictions all over the world. So it's hard to imagine that this won't play a central role in future histories of the event. In terms of cultural history, one of the pandemic's most profound impacts may be upon those aforementioned cultural assumptions about biosecurity. That sense of security from disease, such a hallmark of Western culture in the long 20th century, has now been powerfully challenged, and the cultural impact of this challenge is currently unknowable, but is potentially profound. Will biomedicine save the day with a vaccine and thereby reassert its dominant position in modern culture? Or will the fact that a disease could bring the world to its knees work to erode our sense of biosecurity and even our faith in medical science? We don't know yet, but here the history of vaccination may offer a few clues. Opposition to vaccination has notably risen over the past few decades, but notably it has done so against a backdrop of remarkable security from disease. However, the history of events like the polio vaccine campaign in the middle of the 20th century has demonstrated that popular fears of vulnerability to infectious disease can work to powerfully bolster support for biomedical interventions. And in that case, the fear of polio was so powerful in the 1950s that hundreds of thousands of American parents eagerly volunteered their children to test the Salk vaccine. So future historians will have to work through the cultural and political implications of the reordering of the relationship between publics and science that COVID is sure to force. Now, I've said very little about how to prepare future historians, and I know my time is just about out, so I'll merely make one point. Future historians, it seems to me, will need the ability to critically explore big data. Previous epidemics have produced records that are going to look quaint in the future. Doctors' case notes, diaries, daily newspapers, municipal health reports. These continue to be produced. They're absolutely vital and they will continue to be explored. But so too are massive data sets. To take one example, cell phone data for entire national populations have been correlated with national epidemiological databases using algorithms to correlate population movements and COVID spread. Future historians will not only need to be able to work with these complex, multi-layered historical artifacts to understand them as they were originally intended to be understood, they will also need to be adept at using advanced methodologies to mine these and other data sets to answer their own questions. And more than that, they will have to be able to do what historians of medicine and science have been generally particularly good at, and namely that is epistemology. They will need to unpack these incredibly complex artifacts, both to understand the processes by which the resulting scientific knowledge was produced, and to trace the politics that inevitably will lie embedded deeply within them. Unpacking, the politics from within scientific discourses is typical stuff for medical historians, but in an age of big data, it's going to be a very tall order. So the more practice that we can get working with big data, familiarizing ourselves with methodologies in the digital humanities, the better equipped we're going to be to train our students for the tasks, for their tasks ahead. And I should preempt questions on how best to do this by noting that I am an utter neophyte when it comes to big data and digital humanities. I really don't know the first thing about it, but like a lot of us, I suspect, I have a feeling that it's something that I'm going to need to start to learn. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. That's exactly what I was about to, to ask. Of course, I mean, I think we're beginning to get already from these three presentations a sense of the scale and scope of what historians are going to have to be dealing with as they approach this topic. It's not unfamiliar to us in many ways, but in a sense, we're navigating between sort of that big data that you're talking about, Kevin, down to and integrating Claire's personal data and how we bring those things together into some kind of meaningful dialogue. At the same time, we're moving between the sense of home, the private, the public, local, national, global, going from the micro to the macro, and those intersections of things like environment, technology, medicine, economy. I mean, this is a major task. So the first question I had for the panel is where to start? Where do you start now in trying to move up through those different categories? I mean, obviously it's going to take a long time, but where do we start? Richard, can I turn to you first on that one?
Well, you're the chair. You can do what you like. I don't know is the answer. I mean, like you, I was very struck by the comparison between Kevin and Claire, between the personal and the place where Kevin finished with big data. And I'm intrigued by how, I mean, not just about, how difficult that would be for historians to integrate, but also in some ways how difficult it will be for individuals to navigate. So Claire's wonderful remark about, the diarist saying, I want to speak to the historian. Quite often the dialogue between the personal subjective account and the historian is not a comfortable dialogue because, sometimes the historian says, actually, your historical role wasn't quite what you expected. Clearly, big data will raise all sorts of huge questions, which might be quite troubling questions, like, obviously big data will say how many people died as a result of the lockdown rather than a result of the virus. And we don't really know what the answer to that's going to be. We don't know how that answer is going to change as we go across the world. So Kevin talks about inequalities. Obviously, one possible inequality is that some people find it very, very difficult to survive economic lockdown because they have, no resources to live through it. So you'd be back to your Indian migrant labourers at that stage. So even just in this really crude statistical sense of, how many people died and what did they die of, obviously there are kind of questions to be asked. I was really, I'm talking about my colleagues' papers because I was fascinated by them. I was also really interested by the particular quality of the kind of mass observation type research at the moment. So it strikes me that one of the points about this period, which is different from, say, the period the original mass observation was exploring, was that there's this strange sense of parenthesis and, for some people, inactivity. So obviously mass observation, in the middle of the London Blitz, if you're a fireman, is different from mass observation if you're a locked down person not being able to leave your house and possibly with more time than ever before, but also in a strange kind of way living in a vacuum. So that I'll be really intrigued to see whether this produces particularly rich historical sources or whether perhaps it produces just life writing as a kind of end in itself, and what in the end historians will say about that. So
thank you. Claire, I think it's appropriate that Claire picks up on that point from there. Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm struck. I mean, when you were speaking there, Rich, I was remembering some of the diaries from sort of autumn 39, where people are actually moaning about there not being much happening yet. So that sense of inaction and kind of waiting for something is not necessarily unique to this time. But I take the point about the kind of confinement of people. And that's where I really like that Nottingham project, which is taking that notion of constraint and confinement and kind of asking people to really kind of play with it. I suppose what I was trying to demonstrate with that last extract that I used is that way in which, yes, people, given this constraint and this focus on the self within the lockdown period, it has you know, compelled people, lots of people, to write themselves. But in writing themselves, they write their history, and they try to make those connections to other people, to kind of make their own connections between the past, the present, and what might happen in the future. So I kind of think that it may be life writing, but it's not just life writing. Mm-hmm. It's kind of something that has a real value to us in understanding how at a very individual level people made sense of what was going on around them.
Can I pick up on that a little bit, because this, you know, what we're talking about there is a very this is a very human event in some ways. It's surreal in some ways, and at the same time it's very deeply human. And I just wonder whether we might reflect on why people are writing. I always asked about mass observation, why are people writing for mass observation? Why are they doing this? What kind of human need are they fulfilling? And what does that tell us about how people are responding to COVID?
I mean, I think, like first phase MO, mid-century MO, there are just widely varying motivations for people submitting their diaries. And I think this is, the 12th of May diary is distinct within mass observation, because it pulls in lots of people who aren't, you know, don't self-identify as mass observers. That people who just send in one day and often leave it at that. So there are people who are reading them, and this is obviously my interpretation of their motivation, but some of them, it does seem to have a therapeutic dimension to it. Some people do have that very self-conscious sense that this is history and I need to record it before it gets lost. There are lots of school children who contributed, and they've clearly, it's been organised by their teachers as a useful lockdown activity. So there's a whole range, really. And that's what, I suppose it's those different varied motivations that makes the material quite rich for me.
Kevin,
yeah,
you want to reflect on that, where to start question?
Yeah, well, I mean, is there an old joke about, you know, how do you eat an elephant? Well, you just one bite at a time. You just start at one. I mean, it's such a giant task that it almost doesn't matter where one starts. It just matters that you start. I mean, I think reflecting on the conversation that's just happened. I mean, I think one of the reasons that the kind of stuff that Claire is talking about is so important is that the further out you go from the event, you know, as we're getting decades out from this, a century out from this, it becomes easier and easier to sort of lose the humane stories, the human stories in it, as you just allow the data to become the story. So in some ways, you know, we're going to continue to have to do what we've always been doing, which is dealing with the macro and the micro and finding ways to bring the two together. And in this instant, it just seems like both ends are exploding. The macro is getting so meta, and the micro is exploding as well, when such a huge portion of the Earth's population is recording in one way or another their thoughts and feelings. So at both ends of the spectrum, the job is going to be enormous. But you know, one of the things about sort of big data is like a lot of sort of scientific evidence. In ways, it's immediately very impressive. And one of the things that makes the history of science very important is that it takes this stuff apart and it says, well, wait a second, this isn't just an unobjective truth. This was a discourse which was constructed at a particular moment. This was an historical artifact that was constructed. So let's take the thing apart and then look and say, oh, well, wait a second, look at the assumptions that were made at these different stages of the process. And that can help to, you know, inspire a kind of critical thinking about the product of sort of big data analysis. And so too can tethering to that, the sort of human stories within it, because there's all kinds of possibilities that one can imagine. I mean, if if we get a vaccine and COVID becomes something that ends up being something that we manage and we get through it, and if, at the moment, fewer than 700,000 people have died. If a few million people overall die, the further and further you get from this event, the easier it's going to become for future historians to say, well, a few million, but come on, 50 to 100 million died in 1918, so maybe this wasn't such a big deal. And that sort of rationalization and number crunching always threatens to lose and obscure the humane. So we really need work at both ends of the spectrum and then finding ways to integrate the two.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions left, but at this point, I'd like to ask the audience to start putting their questions into the chat so that we can start grouping them together for our panel. Kevin, I'd just like to pick up on that question of 1918, and it just talking about how suddenly the flu pandemic of 1918 has become visible as a result of recent events. And I just wondered what else for the panel has COVID made visible in this period, or rather what has it forced us to see? Kevin, can I start with you on that?
Do you mean in terms of like specific historical events that it's
more
forced?
Broadly, I think maybe it's just my perception that that COVID has suddenly laid bare all kinds of issues that either we haven't wanted to see, we haven't confronted, and it was really your comment about how the current pandemic has forced 1918 back into a historical narrative that up to now had been dominated by memories of the First World War. And I just wonder what else has been sort of forced forward in that way, whether historical examples or contemporary, just a really broader question.
I think one of the first things that occurred to me when it first broke in March was about what we call essential work, or key workers, essential workers, and the sort of issues around labor. So I did an op-ed piece that looked at these characters called the Searchers of the Dead. And very quickly in early modern plague, they have to find somebody has to go into a house when someone dies and report what the cause of death was, because if it's a plague death, then you have to quarantine. But if it's if somebody has a heart attack, then you don't. So it's a very, very important job. And they, instead of giving this job to doctors, which is what you would think, this is important, get the physicians to do it. The physicians want nothing to do with it because it's very dangerous. And they make basically old pensioners do it. They make elderly, poor women do this. And it just sort of struck me that, there's a long history of thinking about who does the work during an epidemic, and what does this reveal about the value of different kinds of work. Canada shut the border down between the United States very quickly, and within about 48 hours, they made an exception for migrant agricultural workers, because the farmers were like, if we don't have all these migrant agricultural workers, we're not going to get a crop in the ground. And so suddenly, these people who have dodgy status in the country and are not well paid and all the rest of it, terrible conditions, these are kind of seen to be really, really crucial. So it really had the potential to spotlight all kinds of issues around labor, which we heard about in the early days, and it's been fading in more recent weeks, I think, in the news anyway. Thank
you. Claire, can I turn to you on that one?
Yeah, I agree with Kevin in terms of labour and what this has really brought home. I suppose for me, one of the other things that I've been reminded of is our assumptions about how people organise their lives, and particularly assumptions about family life and quite conservative models of intimate relations that have suddenly been assumed to be the norm. And issues around childcare, issues around domestic work have clearly been brought to the fore when time is such a resource, and it's a finite resource in homes. So I think it's those things around those assumptions about, I suppose, normality. And also, I guess, I've just been really interested in how the experience of time has just been so weird. And kind of, that's interesting, just how interesting, God, how interesting time is. Isn't it interesting? And that, you know, that just, its complexity has really been hammered home for me, I suppose.
Thanks. Richard?
Well, I mean, I'd agree with what both Kevin and Claire have said. I was very struck with the point they both made about labour and the importance of certain kinds of things. I think more generally, it's a kind of interesting economic experiment in a way, to say, you know, like shutting down the engines on a 747, finding which ones you can do without before the plane crashes. It's interesting to see which bits of the economy need to be kept going. It's interesting to see, well, obviously for the first time, I suppose, in the West since 1945, issues about who gets the harvest in would matter. Issues about, I suppose, just kind of the impact of the physical world on people. I'm struck I suppose for an early modern historian, it would come very naturally that, you know, you would know what the weather was in the period you're writing about, because obviously that was something that, you know, people would record. Now it strikes me that after 1945, I could tell you it was very cold in 1946 in the winter and very hot in 1976 in the summer. Other than that, there's no point in the period I study when I could tell you what the weather was like. But I think one of the effects of COVID is to focus attention more on the way in which kind of physical conditions might govern people's lives. I'm also really interested, and in some ways, perhaps for reasons that are kind of problems with me, troubled by the role of subjectivity, both in history and in politics. So now I'm interested by the ways in which people say sort of, this is how I feel, and that has a kind of sacred status. I'm struck by interviews sometimes with, you know, television interviews with people who are involved in COVID, where they say, what would you like to say to the Prime Minister? And you think, well, in this way, that's a very strange question. I mean, why should one person's kind of emotional reaction matter? Now, I can see why that's going to be a very important part of overall historical analysis. But I'm struck by how much sometimes people talk now as if it's like the main issue about how people feel. And I'm also struck by the knowledge that eventually all sorts of sources will come along where we will say how people felt was, I mean, you can't exactly say how a person felt was wrong, but you can say how a person felt was at odds with all sorts of other kinds of records about what they were experiencing. You know, I've time and time again interviewed people who told me provided very vivid, very compelling accounts of what happened to them. And when I've gone to the archives, I thought that couldn't possibly have happened. And so I'm slightly intrigued generally by the kind of subjectivization of history and subjectivization of public life, and then how particularly that will interact with COVID.
Claire, you're going to want to come in on that.
Yeah, I agree. No, I think yes, that's true. I think the power of asserting one's feelings as a knowledge claim, it's the ultimate power, because it's indisputable. I think that's, whatever we think about whether that's problematic or not, I think that's interesting that that's the stage we're at. But I think we were already at that stage before the pandemic. I think that's one of the interesting things, is how many of the things that seem innovative in this pandemic are actually just speeding up of things that were happening previously anyway. So I just find it interesting. I find that, you know, I mean, it's obviously a lot of work in oral history on this, going right back into the 70s and 80s, but where the individual's sense of what they have experienced is entirely at odds with what the archive is telling us, that is interesting. It's interesting because it may be that the archive is wrong, But it's more interesting because why have they come up with that particular perspective? What was going on that suggested to, you know, that made them feel that? So I'm less down on the subjectivity, perhaps, than Richard, maybe.
I'm not down. I'm like you. I'm interested, although perhaps interested at a slightly different angle.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to bring Philip Carter in now, who's been curating some of our questions from the audience for the panel.
Thank you, Jo. Thanks very much. There are a lot of questions, and I think to get as many questions to the panel as we can, I will read out the questions as they're in the chat rather than switching back and forth. So, given this is the historical research lecture and we're focusing on the importance of historical research methods, I thought we'd start with the first question from the Research Young Foundation. And that question seems very intriguing, which is, what questions do current historians want today's social science researchers to ask? In what format to collect those insights? We have many more creative methods at our disposal than ever before. How do we best use them for future historians?
Panelists? Anyone want to take that one? Kevin?
I'm going to chew on that for another second.
Sure. Richard, do you
Could
want
I come in rushing in where, you know, angels fear to tread? So I think that the single thing I'd like social scientists to ask most, which will then perhaps provide sources for future historians, is to constantly think who's being missed in this. Yeah. So we've talked about the marginalization of people in terms of, you know, society, but obviously there's also a very important marginalization in terms of the historical record. So I think almost the answer would be to think, who do we know least about? So I don't know, I cycled through central London throughout the lockdown to get exercise. And I was just struck by the fact that there was a group of kind of recalcitrant homeless people who rather admirably in some ways had refused to take, you know, any kind of accommodation that was being offered to them. Now, I assume those people leave very few records, but I'd be really interested to know why they stayed on the Strand when there was nothing open, there was no one to ask for food, you know, blah, blah, blah. Why they were so attached to that kind of area. And then on a very much bigger scale, obviously, I'd be intrigued to know, you know, what COVID is like to live through if you're a subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa and someone kind of completely outside lots of the worlds we've talked about today, probably someone who is neither generating mass data through their mobile phone nor generating records for mass observation.
Thanks. Any of the other panelists want to comment? Claire?
Yeah, I mean, whilst I'd be hesitant to tell social scientists what they should be doing, well, I'd be hesitant to tell them what they should be doing for two reasons. One, because I know a lot of social scientists and they're perfectly capable of coming up with their own ideas about what they should be doing. But secondly, there's some really interesting work now done by historians historicizing social scientific practice. And what will be interesting will be the very question of what social scientists choose to focus on and the methods that they explore this moment for future historians. So kind of, I'd say let them get on with, you know, what they're the experts in the present. We're not.
Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, following up on Richard's comments, you know, one cohort that we're really going to need to know as much as possible about, I think, are the incarcerated. Prisons have been really one of the COVID hotspots. There was a list of the largest outbreaks in the United States, and it was absolutely, I mean, it was basically prisons, long-term care homes, and food processing facilities. But prisons really dominated more than the other categories, and we heard a lot more about long-term care homes and seniors homes than we did about you know, what's going on in prisons. So that would be another sort of cohort that would seem to warrant more attention than they're getting. But now the fact that I know about this means that it is getting some attention. So I don't want to say that it's entirely overlooked, but it's a big part of the story of the spread in North America certainly has been this disease running wild inside of prisons.
Philip?
We're getting a lot of questions relating to forms of source material and the scale that those brings. And that obviously takes us to the question of social media, which has come up quite a lot. Christina Hourigan is asking, is this in a way a watershed moment for how historians deal with social media, both in terms of how they interpret it, but also with an eye to archiving for the future, how that material is best kept and archived for historians in 10 or 20 years' time?
Claire, I'm going to send that one your way. You mentioned TikTok earlier, so I think it's coming your way.
Yeah, that was a mistake, wasn't it? I'm not an expert on TikTok, I'm just going to say that, but my daughter is. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think so. I think but again, there was a lot of work going on by historians of the digital prior to this. I mean, I think we need to be careful not to pretend that that wasn't going on. There's there are loads and loads of incredibly good historians doing work on digital collecting and digital collections. I mean, I suppose one of the things is to make sure that to go back to the previous point, that we're collecting digital material that crosses different categories of people. That we don't just think that having a sort of Twitter archive constitutes the social media experience of this period, when actually for many people Twitter is just not the thing. It's the thing that older people do. It's not what the young people do, I believe. So it's not a very good answer, but I just think that we perhaps need to ask those people who've been doing this for quite some time.
Yeah, or the Born Digital Archiving and the National Archives are very involved now in this, and British Library and others. Yeah. Philip.
We've got a question that relates to the title, Histories of 2020. And of course, the extent of 2020 goes even beyond COVID to questions like Black Lives Matter. And one of the questions raised by several people is how histories of 2020 will intersect with other very striking and very important developments in this year.
Thank you. Richard, can I ask you to come in on that one?
Well, I mean, obviously they will intersect. And obviously, as I think we probably all said, it's hard to know how they'll intersect until we know what happens next. So, we live at a time when there are all sorts of, massive geopolitical shifts, which COVID may be, end up being kind of part of. So, the question is, what changes will it accelerate? What changes will it divert? The answer is, I don't know. I think we shouldn't assume that all other kinds of history have stopped because of COVID. We should assume that this will matter because COVID does interact with other things. And we should remember that there may be problems that turn out to be more existential than COVID. So the obvious one that Kevin mentioned is climate change. There's also the obvious thing that, the world has lived with since the Second World War, really, which is nuclear weapons. It's still a completely kind of unmanaged problem, which may have massive catastrophic effects. In the 1980s, if we'd been doing this kind of panel, we would all have said, nuclear war is the big existential threat to the world. Rather curiously, that's something that historians now very rarely talk about. I think we assume that kind of the end of the Cold War means that threat is managed, rather in the way that we imagined that the success of medicine a few years ago meant the threat of epidemic had been managed.
Kevin, Claire, did you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, I'm sad to hear that we're not all going to just do medical history now. The latest COVID conspiracy is a conspiracy of medical historians to take over the profession. No, I think Richard's right, and we can circle back to the point about national history. I mean, the extent to which, if national histories, continue to be framing the discussion, then COVID may be subsumed within Brexit era Britain's history and Trump era American history and that kind of thing. So we'll have to see the extent. I mean, certainly COVID would seem to be a force driving more global approaches to history. It's hard to write it in isolation, but national historical paradigms are very powerful and have a great and long tradition. There was another point I was going to make, and I've lost it for the moment. I might have to come back to me.
Claire.
Yeah, I'd just say, to add to that, just the transnational ideas that are going on within the 2020 moment as well, which do relate to COVID, but which are not subsumed by COVID. And the key one there, of course, is the anti-racist protests that are properly transnational. And I think that, again, things that are not an invention of 2020, but have been kind of accelerated in this context.
Thank you. Philip.
The other quick.
Oh, sorry, Kevin. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. The only other quick note was to just, to make one more point about the environmental. Future historians are going to look back and they're going to see that, for example, in the United States, the COVID bailout, stimulus package, it was $2 trillion. And future historians may well be focused on saying, well, you could have done a lot to mitigate climate change with $2 trillion. And so, thinking about the existential threat, as Richard suggests, the further away we get from 2020, those sands may be shifting dramatically.
Thank you. Philip.
Number of questions relating to how we write history and remember our history, Richard's point at the very start. Several questions have asked, what does the absence of particular events such as the pandemic of 1957-8 tell us about how we remember past? Are we thinking too much in anniversaries and so on? And another question relating to recent medical history, can we learn things in terms of how the new history is written from very much more recent experiences such as HIV/AIDS, which is starting to gain its own history and historiography?
Kevin, can I turn to you for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, with respect to HIV/AIDS, that had a really powerful influence on medical historiography. In the 80s, you got because it really, I mean, it shook the foundations of that 20th century sense of biosecurity that I was talking about, and the edifice held, but it was certainly shocking that suddenly this new disease that nobody had heard of before, deadly, etc. And so there was a lot of really good work done on thinking about paradigms for studying epidemics, and how Charles Rosenberg and others, did really important, influential work on sort of spotlighting how we think about epidemics and how we write this kind of history. I'm a product of that because I started out working on the history of early modern syphilis in the early 1990s, and that's a footnote to the AIDS epidemic. It was sort of like, why in the early 90s was it suddenly an interesting question to think about the history of STDs? That's the result of HIV/AIDS. So that epidemic certainly had long-lasting impact on medical historiography. Yet again, I say it remains to be seen what COVID's impact is going to be, but it certainly feels like it's going to be significant.
Thank you. Philip, do we have some last questions before we wrap up?
Yes, there are several questions relating to kind of comments on the difficulty of writing history now because we don't know how things are going to develop, changes at the level of the state in terms of response and so on. So I suppose maybe for contemporary historians, how do we engage with a very rapidly moving picture? And one question that's also come up is how far the events of 2020 might shape how we write the history of Brexit in years to come, which we were fixating on until quite recently.
Richard?
I don't know how it will affect how we write the history of Brexit. It won't change my view of Brexit. That's the only thing I can promise. I think one thing I should say in terms of how we prepare for this and so on and so forth. I mean, one of the things I said is I thought the historical profession was in some ways marginalized by these events. And I don't always think that's a bad thing, in the sense that I think historians should be modest and it's probably not a bad thing to say, well, we have to wait a long time. It may not be a comfortable message for Claire and I who work on 20th century history, but maybe sometimes we should say, well, the people who work on the early modern period do have some things going for them in terms of, you know, historical perspective and the rigor that comes from actually genuinely knowing what's going to happen next. I think that historians shouldn't assume that we'd like either that we're going to know what the historical effects of COVID are going to be anytime soon, or that we're kind of magic bullet people who are going to explain everything. Sometimes I think it would be perhaps a consequence of COVID if historians become less important, and therefore we go back to writing trivial books that we used to write called The Structure of Politics at the Accession of George III or Montagu, which are both, you know, incredibly modest titles by the comparison of titles that people often publish now, but tremendously important books in terms of the effects they had. I think I'm probably using up my time, but I just wanted to return a bit to the previous question, actually, that there were 2 points that were raised that interested me very much. One of which was someone referred to a pandemic or an epidemic of 1957. Now, I have first of all to confess, I've never heard of an epidemic of 1957. But secondly, that itself strikes me as interesting, and interesting for other reasons other than just revealing my ignorance, which of course is that COVID is an event in a way that disease hasn't been very much previously. So it's, you know, it's something that has been instantly seen as important across the world. And I think in that way, there's a kind of novelty here. So, you know, it's something that might normally be studied in terms of longue durée history has suddenly become part of événementiel history. The other point I'd like to make, which is striking, we got this far without mentioning AIDS. And I'm very, very struck, having, you know, been old enough to remember what it was like to live through AIDS, by, again, the kind of unknowability of an epidemic when you're living through it. So first of all, obviously, AIDS seemed utterly terrifying in the 1980s. And I never thought that I would know people with HIV who were, you know, talking about where they were going to retire to, that kind of thing. So obviously, in that way, medicine's changed a lot. But also, I think the political effects of HIV were incredibly unexpected. And I think we have an assumption that a disease is kind of branded politically. I think COVID has been branded as a kind of left-wing disease. It's a disease which demonstrates the need for state intervention, a disease that demonstrates the need for people to think about equality. I'm not completely sure that that will be how it will play out in the long term. And when we look back to AIDS, everybody would have said, if we'd been giving a paper like this in 1985, AIDS marks the end of permissiveness, the beginning of kind of a reaction in sexual values. Actually, it seems to me it had exactly the opposite effects. It was a kind of Foucauldian disease because it focused attention on sexual acts, not sexual categories. And in lots of ways, it was the beginning of a period of kind of renewed gay activism. But also, I think, you know, if you wanted to write the history of gay marriage, you'd actually now probably start with the AIDS epidemic, which was something you wouldn't at all have expected at the time. So I think we should be open to the unexpected.
Kevin. Kevin? Yeah.
Oh, me. I agree with what Richard just suggested. I'm trying to get back to what the original question was.
Philip?
I think part of the question was, what can we learn from previous experiences like that, and how might they affect the history as we move on and as this particular event unfolds, because we're in the middle of it.
And I think and part of it was around sort of how can we write it when it's so new and it hasn't been right. I mean, I think that what I was thinking about when I first heard the question was to think about the different kinds of work that historians do. And one of it is sort of, you know, writing professional peer-reviewed books and articles. But, you know, the last few months, there's also been a lot more of this kind of outreach work that historians have been doing. And you know, using the lens of history to try to make sense of the past and to convey lessons, you know, in the popular media and op-ed pieces and that kind of thing. And so I would encourage, you know, historians to continue to do that, although maybe Richard and I disagree in terms of the you know, the role of historians over the last couple of months. I mean, maybe it's because I'm in medical history, but I don't know that I've seen historians sidelined as much as although maybe I'm misunderstanding the point that Richard was making, but it seems that we've been called upon quite a lot, and I would sort of encourage, you know, scholars to continue to do that. And then there was also our teaching, and so this is probably easier for people who teach in medical history, but I'm thinking through how I want to incorporate COVID into my teaching, so that, yeah, I'm not going to be writing the big monograph on 2020 anytime soon, but I do want to be thinking about how I can use my students' experiences living through COVID and tie those into the teaching of history. And that also may incorporate a kind of an archive creation kind of component, you know, asking my students to sort of think about things we're learning in the course and maybe keep a kind of COVID diary in which they draw on historical lessons and try to frame their own experiences. I haven't really thought through this very well yet, but I don't have to do it until January. But those are other fronts that we can be working on, I guess.
Finally, Claire.
On the question of how we can write it when it's so new, when we're in the middle of it, I mean, history writing is always in motion, isn't it? It's always partial, and I think it's probably, given the enormity of what seems to be going on, given the things we've talked about in terms of the massive data sets and massive sets of intimate data sets, I think that as historians, it's probably just a useful thing to us to be reminded to be a bit humble about our conclusions, and that not to stop us making them, but just to actually just, you know, and to listen to those working in other disciplines as well. I mean, one of the things that seems to have been very striking is the need for that kind of cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary work to kind of solve what's going on, but also to draw on the approaches. We mentioned social scientists a little earlier, but to talk to social scientists about what they're doing now and what we might be doing. So I would say sort of, yeah, a little bit of modesty, humility, and talking to people, really.
Thank you all so very much. I was going to end on a question about the historical profession and the effects of COVID on the historical profession, but I think that's a whole other event and discussion. But you've all touched on that in different ways, but it's certainly something that we'll all need to reflect on as we go forward. So all then that remains for me to do is to thank everyone, to thank Philip and to Gemma at the IHR for organising this event and pulling it together, to say a special thank you to our speakers, to Claire, to Kevin and to Richard, and finally thank you to the audience for coming along this evening. Thank you very much and good evening. Thank you.